Okay, thank you everybody for coming to this, the last, I think, of the plenary sessions at the conference. I'm Neil Campbell, and my job is a very simple one, and a very good one. I get to introduce my good friend and colleague, Chris Tacoma. I have a very formal piece to read, which I'm going to do, and then I'm going to tell you the truth. So Chris Tacoma is Associate Professor of English and Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Women, Gender and Sexuality at Rice University, Houston, Texas. She's published essays about critical regionalism and feminist thought, questions of history and literature and critical theory, civil rights literatures and post-civil rights imaginations, and issues of youth politics and girlhood under neoliberalism. She's the author of the books Landscape of the New West, Gender and Geography in Contemporary Women's Writing, and most recently Surfer Girls in the New World Order. She's currently at work on a project that spans both the public humanities as well as work in feminist literary and cultural criticism. This past summer, she founded the Institute for Women Surfers and conducted its inaugural meeting in Oceanside, California. She's the past president in 2003 of the Western Literature Association. So that's the formal bit. I want to say just a couple of very brief things about Krista. I think one of the great things about Chris Tacoma is how much influence and support she has on people who are interested in Western studies in the broadest sense. And speaking personally, she's had a huge influence on my career, and our work has kind of coincided, and we've met many times to discuss our ideas, which in some ways overlap and diverge in very productive ways. But more importantly than me, although there's hardly anything more important than me, but more important than me is the fact that Chris Tacoma has had a huge influence on other scholars, young scholars in particular, and the evidence of that, if you haven't seen it, is a recent edition of the Western Literature Journal, which she edited and which introduced a whole array of young scholars in Western studies. And in my view, it was one of the best editions of that journal that's really ever come out. And a lot of that was down to the innovative thinking of Krista. And I think that's typical of her kind of encouragement of all people working in this field. So I'm going to shut up, turn the floor over to Krista, who is visiting Spain for the first time, but hope you'll give her a warm welcome. Chris Tacoma.
Wow, what a great introduction. Thank you so much, Neil. Yes. We have a lot of people here. This is wonderful. So I wanted to be sure to thank David Rio, for all the details that he's done. He's been really great at the details, but also especially for just incredible hospitality, all these visits we've had, all the tapas we've been eating. It's been great. And also some of the guys on the ground, like Tony and Angel, who have also helped with the conference. It's just been really gracious time here. And I also wanted to thank David for entrusting your smart and fun grad student, Merci Albert Yasser, who came to Houston for 5 months beginning last spring, and who on a student visa from the Spanish ministry, and who we worked together for many months. We ran all over the place and had fun. We worked with the surfers together. We had a lot of time in the water together. So, I mean, it was just really, it was great. It was a moment of feminist collaboration. It was a moment across many borders of feminist collaboration, and just hopeful for the future in terms of, Rice and the University of Basque Country. So just thank you for all those things. So this work is very much in process. It's part of work over a couple of books to open the field of U.S. West study and to re-inhabit spaces conventionally considered Western by means of other knowledges that comprise it, especially those related to women, to people of color, to indigeneity, to queer notions of dwelling, and none of which are the same geographies. It comes also out of research underway, which Neil just mentioned, in a book project that proceeds along two fronts. One of them is a public humanities project about activist surfing that takes its methodology from concepts of engaged research. And I just thought I would show you the flyer for this project we did over the summer. I'm going to go quickly through some of this stuff here. We did this grassroots educational initiative with a lot of surfers over the summer. You can see the concepts are key concepts for Western studies. So partly what I thought I was doing is a kind of local Global West seminar with a lot of activist surfers. And then I wanted to show this picture because of Merchie! Yay! So that's really fun. And here's the more theoretical aspect of engaged research. So I have a lot of slides that are going to footnote stuff I don't really want to digress from a more straight narrative to talk about. Okay, so that's one project. The other is a project of feminist critical theory and literary studies. That's what I'm going to work on here today. I've worked on it not a lot publicly yet, and so I'm glad to do it. The project is organized around issues of national border crossings. Borders here are crossings between the U.S. and Mexico, but also between U.S. and tribal lands, so U.S. federal lands and tribal lands. In some respects, these are disparate projects, the Public Humanities Project and the Literary and Feminist Theory Project, but they also overlap and theorize one another. What brings them together is this argument that I'm in the process of thinking through about contemporary political imaginations of activists and of writers that join notions of feminist states with those of critical regionalism. My emphasis in the book is storytelling across activists and literary sites and their productions of this dream, this structure, this side of thinking and attachment and activism called feminist states. The idea of the new work is an effort to think beyond discussions of the demise or the aftermath of feminism. So here's some of the people in my mind when I'm thinking about conversations I'm having with theorists, to think about political grammars of the present and current feminist worlding projects like those of the Public Humanities Project, which has come up with this term, surf feminisms. How is it that writers and activists of the present respond effectively to the broad political climate of post-feminism? One response that I'm offering is they do so through feminist states of critical regionalism. Okay, so I've titled this talk through that phrase just to cut a broad path so I can do some work with the concept of critical regionalism, do some work with the relationship of it to feminist states, and to notions of critical geography. I will be thinking about how the struggle over invasion or geography is, of course, ongoing, since it's not a struggle over an initial historical event, as we, I think, know well now from settler colonial theory. So it's not about an event, it's about the ongoing navigation of a structure that adapts. So it's not an event, it's a structure. I'm thinking about the struggle that struggle via feminist expressions of it in literature and film, and tracking what they help us to understand first about what has happened, next, and then after that, what comes after, what comes next. Quite a number of textual examples are in my mind for the talk. I'm not going to turn out to work on all of them, but if you don't know all these texts, which you're not likely to know some of them, since they're kind of new or not very widely read, I don't think, I just wanted to write them down here. I'm grateful for the chance to work on this here and to think about borders as a theoretical concept right now. It has such a long history as a theoretical concept, but it's doing a different kind of work for me now in my work. So let's see, what's next? Oh, all right. These are some of the things I was going to do that I didn't turn out doing. So I had them as slides, and this is this new piece, Ramona. Opal by Ramona Emerson, who's a feminist filmmaker, Navajo Nation. And if you haven't seen this special issue on Indigenous cinema and Indigenous Westerns that Susan Bernardin, our colleague, did last summer, this is really, not only is this work fresh and new, it's also incredibly heartwarming, I think. There's a lot of work in intergenerational nurture, which is work I like so much and consider myself to be doing. And I did it in the surf book, and I continue to do that. Okay, so now we're working on, I'll leave it there. So we're now working on spatial politics of critical regionalism. For me, the concept of critical regionalism imagines political life in the present. It thinks about issues of place, bodies in place, and knowledges derived not only via textuality and discourse, but from place as a critical location and orientation, a material structure. Critical regionalism is a way of diagnosing new configurations of meaning, time, and space, occasioned by global restructuring and new technology. It is a political and cultural imagination, a mode of embodiment, whose keywords and ethical domains are under construction. Critical regionalism, in my view, can help us rethink critical race theory and come to terms with some of these new terms in settler colonial studies, subaltern settlers, settlers of color, queer settlers, and especially with disentangling indigenous political strategies or theories of refusal and sovereignty from very different kinds of U.S. minority claims for recognition, inclusion, and citizenship. Critical regionalism, for me, therefore, is not a synonym for transnational analysis, but a method of critical global study attuned both to the comparative big picture analysis, but also always linked to the deep local. I'm skeptical about knowledges gained from surfing the macro surfaces of media and cultural flows across borders if one isn't also grappling with local sites, because people and communities have profoundly disparate relations to issues of mobility, storytelling, and global capital flows. Some places, in fact, like Indian tribal lands in the US and women's bodies in many places of the world, are really at pains to establish themselves as bounded, as boundaried, not porous spaces, not open to anybody who wishes to cross through them. I doubt that any of us would challenge the idea that mobility is unevenly distributed in the New World Order, but how do we want to tease out and theorize those kinds of differences? What are the politics of mobility? Who moves when, under what circumstances? Which notions of place travel? Which theories travel? Which texts travel? All of those are questions that I'm thinking about. In other words, what makes our critical regionalisms critical? A number of critical regionalisms circulate now. They aren't all the same. They don't make the same claims, establish the same genealogies, offer the same perspectives on aesthetics, on mobility, on global capitalism, on whatever, a whole list of things. What are the implications of this or that version of critical regionalism? So the term has a particular genealogy, and Neil Campbell's work in Rhizomatic West is absolutely the go-to source on this genealogy. As he said already, we have lots of productive overlaps, and his work has been completely important to mine, and I learned so much from it. And the field has benefited enormously from it. But my own work to theorize critical regionalism, and this won't be a surprise to people that know my work, is not Deleuzian. The kinds of primary texts and people, as well as theories I work with, teach me that the contemporary global scene is characterized more by friction than by flow. So I lean more, and these are some of the people I'm thinking about, and just to say, Neil was working the other day with Anna Singh, and I also work with Anna Singh, and we overlap, but we also come to other conclusions, which I just think is exactly as it should be. So I lean in the direction, for instance, right now in my own thinking about critical regionalism, toward the critic and border theorist José Limón, who's an anthropologist as well as a literary critic, because he's interested in questions of poetics, but he's also interested in the deep local. I'm also interested in the work of Spivak, in Who Sings the Nation State, and in Other Asias, who sees in critical regionalism the shape of what she calls an abstract state, and who ties the ideals of critical regionalism to hopes for democracy from below. So I'll come back to Spivak in a minute, but some of my thoughts also about critical regionalism are tied into post-regionalism, and so I'm going to work just a minute with Tatum, post-regionalism, in Susan Colleen's completely important book, Post-Western Cultures. So Steve Tatum consults the geographer Ed Soja to theorize the new geographies of power that have resulted from global transformations of regions into post-regions. Tatum, as does Neil Campbell, Paul Giles, and most world systems theorists, reads local and regional cultural economies and relations of people to place as deterritorialized these days from specific geographical site. Tatum retains interest in issues of political economy and power. What is important for him is that the increased global flows of the present loosen economic and historical ties to national centers at the same time that they redirect regions toward regional and trans-regional trading blocs. So regions take on new spatial shapes. And part of the reason I thought that this was somewhat, involved. So I tried to give brief visual summaries of what I was talking about in broad strokes. So these kind of new post-regions we might think of as the EEC, the NAFTA, CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, Mercosur, which is the Southern Cone Trade Agreement. And when I was in Australia over the summer, you would see all over the airports in financial capital kinds of advertising, South-South, we're doing business today, South-South, and because Australia does so much business with Asia, and specifically China. So I'm interested in these new regional shapes, these economic and cultural blocks, like a bloc like NAFTA, as not just a site of economies, but a site of political imaginations that are under development. Tatum doesn't name this new structure of regional blocks, critical regionalism, but Gayatri Spivak's work focused on Asia and its contemporary restructurings under global capitalism does call the reordered regions in that part of the world critical regions. In them, Spivak sees the possibility of new critical imaginations. For Spivak, those new critical imaginations are linked to notions of a renovated state, the concept of critical regionalism. Spivak tells us retains the abstract structure of something like a state. She embraces critical regionalism as a going under and over nationalisms, and where she wants to go with it is toward the relations to state power of those who are especially vulnerable. Spivak sees the state as what she calls an ally, an instrument of redistribution of resources. For her, critical regionalism redresses problems of precarity. It supports the possibility of democracy from below. One feature of her work, for my own work, is this retention of the importance of the state. José Limón, too, makes the case for the continuing importance of the state. In transnational thought, the state is often not one of the central players in analyses. It's as though states don't really exercise power anymore, and people and cultural forms move around however they like. And in my view, that's just not true. There are a lot of stays on mobility in the New World Order, a lot of extenuating circumstances, and the literature and film that I'm working on are going to give us some examples of that in a minute. So for me, the question is what kind of a feminist state might name or perceive these kind of complications. My work is trying to bend Spivak's formulation toward the borderland spaces that I know the best. So this is the key argument. The idea is to understand post-regional blocks like NAFTA, for instance, as border spaces as sites of new feminist political imaginations, new forms of political regionalism. I'll do a little more work here in feminist state theory, and then we'll turn to our texts. I'm interested in feminist states conceived from the standpoint of particular border spaces and places, and here I'm taking inspiration from recent thinkers like Ashwini Tambe. Tambe lauds or praises feminist work on the post-9/11 state for the ways that it has innovated key concepts of basic state theory: sovereignty, security, social welfare. So for instance, work on violence against women and feminist work coming out of the field of development and poverty studies has reformulated understandings of security so that they speak beyond security as simply a military concern to address other issues like women's bodily integrity and safety, as well as social welfare concerns like the provision of basic needs. Tambe's own innovation in state theory tries to call attention to the importance of geographic location in theory making. Tambe critiques the universalist thinking of some of the classic theories in feminist state theory, Catherine McKinnon, Wendy Brown, theories that in her view speak from nowhere and are assumed to be relevant everywhere. They don't cite geographical coordinates or national contexts. And for Tambe, that isn't persuasive. She encourages us to think more carefully about the place from which we're doing theory. So I find this work is compatible with my own interest in place as a site for feminist theory and for feminist world making. Okay, so here's the transition to more literary and film texts. It's not only or even especially theorists who've been innovating conceptions of the state. Writers and filmmakers have been addressing the contemporary period through all kinds of concerns related to the state, to its possibilities, its disciplining mechanisms, and women and girls' interface with state apparatuses. The state and ideas about its shape and purpose now in this post-9/11 moment are important features of the worlds imparted to us in stories, the world that storytellers are trying to figure out, the world we're trying to figure out as readers when we read stories. Issues of citizenship, of borders, of security and violence, of social welfare, of the reproductive body, of the prison industrial complex. I'm now just making a long list, right? All of these thematics work their way through a lot of the literature and film that I'm gathering together in this project and suggest feminist recastings of some of the key conceptual centers of state theory. Okay, so I'm going to try to draw. Did I go back to? No. I'm going to draw here from an archive of materials I am collecting presently, which to me isn't as obvious as it used to be to compile. I think we're definitely in a post-civil rights period, and obviously in popular culture, also in literary criticism. And while in some ways there's never been more literature about the West, at the same time it seems like it's hard to find, or it's hard to gather, for me anyway, it's hard to gather together, it's hard to interpret. So I'm talking about several texts here in order to make some broad points about these two spatial zones, which I see as sites of feminist states. One is across, I think I can do this now, the US-Mexico border. The other is at the border of US federal lands and Indian tribal lands. So as a reading strategy, I'm focusing in the book on scenes of what I call institutional encounter between women in various sites of the state and in textual resolutions to problems that the texts raise. For instance, what will heal issues of violence against women, sexual violence, etc. I'm also really interested in what I already noted as this phrase, through this phrase, storytelling in the present, meaning strategies of telling stories, what stories are told, what stories are withheld, and the rhetorics through which women's problems get represented. So the first spatial train I thought about would be the US-Mexico borderlands. This is super well represented, I think, at this point in US Western literary studies. Not much of it, though, really prioritizes the life in the border for women and girls. Of course, the canonical exception to this is Anzaldúa, but even though she's a key theorist in the field, I think the border work is still pretty interested in issues of masculinity. One border text I'm interested in here is by a newer writer people probably won't know. Do you know this woman, Maria Amparo Ruiz? Not Maria, not her. No, Maria Amparo Escandon. Ruiz de Burton we know. Does anybody know Escandon? Okay. She's written a couple of books. She's had one of her books made into a film. The film name is Santitas. She's a Mexican writer, writing in English, living in LA. She's very interesting for a lot of different reasons. Anyway, so I want to talk about her second novel, Gonzalez and Daughter Trucking Company. I'm going to talk about a little with Cisneros' Woman Hollering Creek. People may know that text, yes? How many people know Woman Hollering Creek? Some, okay. That tends to be a well-known text. It came out in the late 90s or mid-90s, a lot of feminist criticism on it. So Gonzalez and Daughter Trucking Company locates readers in a women's prison in Mexicali. And from the prison yards, inmates can view the actual California-Mexico border. Few places have the mark of the state so much upon them as does this institutional site of the prison. The young protagonist is in prison for a curious accident that she's responsible for, but that was her father's fault, which sets up an interesting paradox of accountability and gender. The text is about guilt, forgiveness, storytelling, women in prison, how they got there, and how they got there we learn, and we know this sociologically anyway, is usually in relation to men as criminals or as predators or in crimes of avenging killing. Women get pissed off at the men who hurt them and kill them. So the issue of security is very interesting here for feminist state thinking, since security for these women has to do with much more than state theory usually imagines as important. It has to do with more than defending borders from immigrants or external aggression or protecting markets. All of these women, we come to learn as readers, experience all kinds of forms of male violence. Security in the state being imagined in this novel must include what we might call female sovereignty, the security of the borders of women's bodies. Indeed, interestingly, inside the prison, women actually are safe from one of the principal sources of violence in their lives, which is the individual men who commit acts of violence against them. There's a huge amount to say about this novel. This is very schematic reading. So I'm going to jump here to thinking about the state and issues of commerce in the book. Before the protagonist is jailed, she is the daughter of a trucker who is himself illegally in the U.S., and he's making his living and supporting himself and his daughter by hauling goods all over the highways of the U.S. that have been opened up by NAFTA. As a set of popular images or concerns, NAFTA typically does not invoke or suggest women in its representations of trade, labor, or narco-trafficking. I mean, there's exceptions to this, but I think generally that's true. So from the vantage point of a figure like Escandón, we get a different sense of this new U.S.-Mexico regional bloc or borderlands territory. We have to ask a different set of questions about it. Escandón's work shows how politics on the border has changed and moved away from the civil rights period, social locations of somebody like Sandra Cisneros, super well-known Chicana, toward a far more transnational literary scene, even though Escandón also shares with Cisneros a border feminism for this moment in history. Maybe some of you have read the Women Hollering Creek essay, which I only started thinking about this because I was working with a student on it. And I thought in light of new ideas about critical region, there was something new to say. So I'll work on it just a minute. I'm taking off around a scene of institutional encounter in that text. And at Rice, we have tons of pre-med students who often take the women, gender, and sexuality major or the English major because it's a way to do other things than biochem. And we have a lot of stuff in public health, gender health, and well-being. So I was thinking about it from a public health vantage point, which is what opened the story to me. Okay, so the story takes off from a chance meeting in a prenatal health clinic between a pregnant Mexican national and a local Chicana health worker. So this is in South Texas. The Chicana clinic worker recognizes the signs of battering on the pregnant body of this Mexican woman. She gets on the phone to her, Chicana compañera. And the story then shows us this underground, what I would call critical regional feminist public health network that transits the pregnant woman with the toddler son she already has across the border, returns her to her Mexican family, removes her from context of a violent marriage in the Texas border region. So what brings the Escandón and the Cisneros tales together is the shared scenes of institutional encounter and what those scenes tell us about ties between critical regions and feminist states. Escandón imagines her Mexicali prison for women very, very fancifully. On-site services include nail and hair. Got to have good nails in prison. That's supposed to be sort of funny. Okay. Childcare, a library and Wednesday story group, a beachfront R&R space. I mean, what's interesting to me about this is the comic relation of this site to the kind of expectations readers bring to the Mexican prison, particularly recently through a very scary Mexican prison and Mexican violence on the border in examples that we could easily think of, All the Pretty Horses, No Country for Old Men. There's a lot to say about all of this, but the takeaway for me is that Escandón is a road novel. The subtitle, which I didn't include here, is Gonzalez and Daughter Trucking Company, a road novel with literary license. This is a road novel. She's trying to talk toward the tradition of road novels, etc., and show her literariness. because she's taking license with the tradition. But in this text, she's a kind of prisoner to the road. The road isn't a site of possibility or freedom for her. What frees her is this culture of women in prison who help her tell her story to herself and eventually, through a series of steps, help her rehabilitate her father, who is in need of rehabilitation. In Cisneros, the scene of institutional encounter is healthcare and its delivery, and what makes a difference for the battered pregnant woman is the workers in the local prenatal delivery site who speak her language, who can read her gendered cultural location as a recent immigrant, and make use of local Texas knowledge and resources and travel routes to intervene across all kinds of national, class, language lines, and alter her situation. In both examples, the borderlands has been reimagined as a material place for feminist world-making. A kind of state thinking emerges which ignores classic notions of the nation-state in favor of critical regional ties that navigate borders, like the people who live in these regions navigate borders. Issues of female security emerge as key needs and networks of women helping women in each text redistribute justice and offer models for how to think of feminist border state now. All right, well, how am I in time? Good? All right. Let me move to, so that's the part on the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. What I want to move now to is this very different national border crossing context, the one between indigenous lands and U.S. federal lands. And so I'm going to work on the recent Louise Erdrich text, The Roundhouse. Now, here people probably have read this text. How many people have read this text? Okay, some. All right. Well, this is a big text in the U.S. It won the National Book Award. Louise Erdrich, as you know, has written quite a lot. But I think this is a very different text for her, even though I've been listening to some great papers here, and she's building toward it. People have been reporting on. I haven't read everything of hers. She's written quite a lot. So this is a text that takes up issues of the state very directly. Roundhouse is about a very brutal rape and attempted murder of an Ojibwe woman by a white man on Ojibwe tribal lands, which lie inside geopolitical spaces of North Dakota, right? So we're dealing with reservation space inside of state space. What's at stake in the tale is the murky place where the murder is committed, since this place is the crossroads of tribal lands, U.S. state land, federal land, and in this specific place, the question of sovereignty and legal jurisdiction is very unclear. It turns out that nobody, the state, the feds, the tribe, has jurisdiction, and this is in spite of the fact her husband is the local judge and she herself has all this legal experience, and they're both associated with tribal legal institutions. So Erdrich is highlighting a place in which Native women can be murdered with impunity, insofar as there are other killing zones, other killing fields of women in North America, and there's a lot of work among Native feminists in Canada about a killing zone there. Certainly there's been a lot of work about the femicides in Juarez, and we know this in the U.S. very well, insofar as she's signaling. Do people know about this in Spain? Yes? Show of hands, yes, you know about Juarez? Okay, not that many people, okay. It may be a more regionally, trans-regionally knowledge. Anyway, there's lots of women who've been killed in Juarez. I don't know what the current estimate is, but that's a whole digressive conversation. Erdrich is pointing to a site in this novel that has related geographical coordinates where there are related femicides. Roundhouse is a tale about state thinking, the limits of tribal law and sovereign jurisdiction, the importance of place to any kind of state theory that would interrupt ongoing efforts to colonize Native women through acts of terror like this rape. This is also a tale about alternative justice systems and feminist engagements with not only ideals of prison abolition, so this is a text, I think this is a prison abolition text, but also Native analytics that offer the potential to undo the logics of settler colonialism, which people understand rape to be, undo it from within. The crime in this tale is adjudicated ultimately by way of indigenous concepts of morality, derived from dream as a source of memory, as well as intellectual tribal history, as well as Western legal rational thought. This adjudication satisfies a communal accounting for the crime, but the kind of complications of the way it's satisfied, the accounting are really pretty impossible. A feminist theory of state drawn from such sources would raise questions of prison abolition, indigenous knowledge, alternative accountabilities, and think with, but also beyond, Western legal theory toward decolonial futures. I want to think a minute about the storytelling practices in this tale and their implication in how problems get structured and told. In the tale, who speaks about rape, who and what is injured, is part of the question posed by Erdrich's choice of this strategic 13-year-old son of the woman who's been raped as the narrator. So one of the most important, I think, and really powerful and certainly, poignant parts of the book is the proximity of these two tales, of the boy's coming of age and the woman's post-traumatic stress syndrome meltdown. So you have, sometimes these stories parallel each other on the same page. Like one paragraph is this, and 2 paragraphs later that is the boy. And what's really, I think, mature about this book is that there's such a deep affection of the narrator for the boy's antics. The adult male is the narrator, but then there's this other narrative voice, in my view. It's kind of feminist narrative voice. There's an affection for him, a deep affection for him, for his antics, for all the sexual innuendo that you get about with him and all of his buddies, all of their comic sexual prankings and fascinations. There's, I would say, a kind of maternal fondness for him as kind of just a boy, after all, who didn't create the world into which he's coming of age. And it makes you, as a reader, super sympathetic. And this is all set against this mother who's barely holding on. The boy, however, is not finally let off the hook, because one of the parallel stories has to do with his love of, but also his complete objectifying gaze on his aunt, who has a history of sex work, of stripping. And, sex workers have, it seems normal to engage in further acts of violence against them, and including his own. So in the scheme of the text, his harassment of her, his desire of her, he hustles her basically, is not at all the same as the crime that's been visited on his mother, and that's not the argument I'm making. But there is 1 or 2 scenes in which he definitely crosses the line, right? 13, 14-year-old, he just loves his aunt's breasts. He's he's obsessed, actually. And it's very charming how he tells you about it, but there's a moment, where he takes it too far. And what his aunt tells him, so he crosses the line, his aunt says, you're just an asshole, like every other guy I know like you who's an asshole. And he hears her, so the text holds him accountable. And this truth that she's uttered and that he knows is right changes him, and he carries this as a lesson about what even the best of men can visit upon women. So I think all of these stories told side by side add up to the text's power and add up to the way in which it's different from the whole oeuvre, I think, of Erdrich's work. The story for me is not so much about what the boy needs to learn, because he learns it, and we learn that he learns it. The story is about the irreconcilable conflicts between maternal social locations, female sovereignty, and contemporary social life. It's a story about what needs to be changed and decolonized. The mother's story, ultimately, I would say, is eclipsed by the son's narrative, but who has created this structure, right, other than Erdrich? So the structure of this text emphasizes, to my reading, and I'm reading a bunch of other stories around it in my mind and in the larger project, the story emphasizes stories that go untold. Why? And we could speculate a lot about that. I started to, but then it's taking too long. So now I'm switching to the last film thing that I want to read, and then I'll wrap up. Another high-profile tale told in 2012 from this border between Native American and U.S. American lands is the Hollywood feature film August, Osage County. Have people seen this film? Some people. Most people, I think, find it's been talked about as dark comedy, but I think most people think it's just too dysfunctional to even be viewable. And but what I see in it is a settler colonial state in collapse, told through the juxtaposed gorgeous, clear landscapes of Western cinema, right? These long landscape shots in Oklahoma, driving to and from Oklahoma from Colorado, of the Julia Roberts character who lives away. So all of that is shot against the abject and traumatic life stories of these hardscrabble women of the Dust Bowl era in Oklahoma. At the beginning and end of this tale of the settler is the native Cheyenne caregiver, Jonna. The institutional encounter I want to emphasize here is between indigenous presence and settler colonial occupation. One of the key moments early in the film concerns practices of naming, of calling Jonna first an Injun, then an Indian, then a Native American. And the matriarch, played by Streep, quips, they aren't any more Native American than I am. Let's just call the dinosaurs Native American while we're at it. So she thinks this is very funny, right? The joke here turns out to be on this family of women who are slowly dismantled in their relations to one another, Jonna serving as witness to what seems, by the last scene, will be their family's extinction. They head toward the fate of the dinosaurs. In a powerful final scene, to me, of grace, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts, Jonna cradles the abjected head of Streep, since Streep has chased away all of her daughters and now she's abandoned. Jonna, I read not so much as a caregiver or as a last chance for Streep. That is, I don't think she's picking up the pieces, but I see her as poised in the film's visual economy, which has all these shots of native imagery as it goes through. I see her poised to inherit what was loosely hers to start with, which is the Osage birthright. Osage County abuts the Osage Nation. Audiences are asked to think about international border crossings between U.S. and tribal lands. Western cinema and most other locations in pop cultural imagination don't typically plot the U.S. as mapped or disrupted in its territorial sovereignty by indigenous sovereign nations. What the film gestures towards is the some 56 million acres held in trust by the U.S. for various tribal lands and individuals. And it frames this history of cultural contact in the present through relations between women. Osage County, moving toward a conclusion, leaves us with Jonna, and I think you have a sense that her story is untold, but it's on some kind of cinematic brink of tellability. While the story of the mother Streep, the Violet character, has been told, and it's been told through raging scene after raging scene of a kind of grief that just can't stay in place. Violet's story, this is the Streep character, is on the brink of being untellable, especially at this post-feminist moment in history. It's too angry, it's crazy angry. Even while, of course, once one hears the story that's behind the kind of anger, the violence, the sadism of Violet's mother against her daughters, the beating of the mother's boyfriends, of Violet's sister, one time with a hammer to the head. I mean, this isn't polite storytelling, this is hardcore truth-telling about poverty as a form of total desperation, about selling sex, whatever else you have to do to get by. And it ruins this woman to have lived it, and it ruins her daughters to have heard it. But I don't know that that means it ruins the viewers to hear it. This kind of a rage, just from my vantage point, seems to me just right. What do people imagine? Lives underneath the kind of violence that these stories tell. There's a kind of feminist analog I see in this film to something like Blood Meridian, a testimony to the violence of women's lives, and there are various kinds of border crossings, and we haven't even started to hear the tale of Jonna. The closest, I think, maybe you could think of a different example, that I think we've come to hear Jonna's story in indigenous literature is Silko's Almanac of the Dead, and nobody liked Almanac of the Dead, really. People they preferred Ceremony. So I think the film is really, it's doing something different. So I don't really have a conclusion here. I just thought that everything's in process. I thought that Osage County closes for us with the question of what's next. Julia Roberts departs to Colorado. She's heading west. She's relieved of the burden of this mother, of this impossible mother. The Jonna character cradling the head of the matriarch, what is next for her? I don't think we know. The mother, I think her life is done. But for the daughter, and for us as daughters of the encounter, including Jonna, things aren't done. The story isn't over. And that's where I thought I would leave it.
Do you want to sit back over
Yeah, I
there?
think I will.
Okay, so we have about 11 minutes or so, maybe 10 minutes, if you want to clear the room as well for the next panel. So we have
Susan has a question. You guys can hear me? Yeah. Yeah?
Krista, I just wanted to run a reading by you of August Osage County and see what you think of this, because I saw the play produced on stage, and then I wanted to see it filmed. And what I was trying to do was figure out the Jonna character, and I was like, oh my gosh, here we have, the Black Yoda character, that TV trope of the wise, racial other who's going to help the white people. But then I thought that maybe that family was mixed race, because what they did with Meryl Streep and with all the daughters is have them dye their hair, this kind of almost flat color. And I was thinking about the whole racial history of that region, and they remove Sam Shepard. The daughters, none of the children look like Sam Shepard. They look like the mother. And so then I was thinking that maybe this is a story about, yes, the collapse, I like that, the collapse of the, settler colonial family, but also sort of that racial erasure of that kind of multiracial West. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if you think maybe the film director was trying to bring in this ghostly racial past with that family. I don't know. I haven't seen anybody say anything about this, but it just struck me when I watched the film. Visually, maybe they're Native American, mixed race.
Yeah, I think that there's ways that one could explore that. Do you have something to say on that topic, Jennifer? Just because, like there's so much signing of Native symbols at key moments in the text, where the son comes to the father, one of the sons comes to one of the father, not the street. Well, anyway, when he comes into town, there's this muralistic background that has some kind of a chief and head feathers, and there's a lot of moments like that. So that's possible. Also, you have, Violet's sister is actually the mother of Forbidden Love. And so I think that could be a possible reading. I guess the large thing I would say about that film is just not to see its dysfunction as larger than a single family unit, and that's its value. That's, I think, what makes me willing to think to entertain it, because a dysfunctional family in and of itself isn't, I don't find it entertaining. Yeah. Jennifer.
Hi, Krista. I was wondering if you might share some comments on one particular aspect of the mother character. I have to admit that I had tickets to go see this play when it was being produced in Atlanta, and I actually returned my tickets because I learned that the mother's character, I believe, had some sort of an oral cancer. Is that correct?
Right.
A mouth cancer. And so in a knee-jerk reaction, I sent my tickets back and I said, I'm not going to watch this, because I had a feeling that somehow this cancer is being used as a cliche, as some sort of a punishment on the mother, or I don't know. These are sort of half-formed thoughts, and I wonder if you had any thoughts about the mother and disease, and maybe the body's boundaries being permeated by disease.
I mean, I can see where you're going. Maybe.
Yeah?
I don't know that. Yeah, sure. I don't know that's really my own train of thought. I
Yeah.
mean, but is she punished by the film? I think the story she tells us is of the punishment of her life, and
Yeah.
so I don't. That isn't the kind of reading I typically make, but I'm persuaded by it if you want to make it.
Really? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in it as this meta text kind of thing. Yeah. Oh, hi.
Thank you very much. It was a very, very intriguing talk, and it made me think about work that I'm doing with Black communities in the West, and seeing them or viewing them as Imperium and Imperial, I focus very much on the space itself, but not necessarily the crossings. And so it was just really interesting to hear what you were saying. And so in light of that, I have a question about what you were saying about the female body. And I'm wondering if you've thought about this or you discussed this at all in your project, this question of is the female body more vulnerable within the borders or at the crossing?
I don't know. I think that's a question I need to think about. It's a useful question. I appreciate it. I think I guess I would try, I don't know about a large claim. I would need to think through that, through like a lot of different examples and really parse them out. In the Erdrich text, I think there's not a site of safety. So there isn't a site of, there's a kind of exposure. So just take your pick. I mean, you can't prosecute white men on the tribal lands. The guy who does this to her is explicitly says this is a hate crime, basically, and he chooses the space he chooses strategically because he knows it's legally disqualifiable. I would have to think about that, you know, because there's so many things that come into play. The whole, what we know about border crossings, just what we've known for a long time from places in Mexico, Central America, traveling through Mexico into Texas and elsewhere. We know that border crossing for women is different, is dangerous in a way that's different than it is for men. There's different vulnerabilities. That's not to say it's not dangerous for men. The same thing with Juarez, Mexico. I mean, the femicides have a particular kind of political power in Juarez, but the number of men killed exceeds the number of women killed by astronomically. I mean, I think the men are just being ruined in many ways, and the recovery from that is going to be very long term. The young men. So I don't really know. I appreciate the question. I think that, do you have a thought yourself?
Well, for these particular texts, no, because I haven't read, I do those texts, and so I was just curious.
How about for the text you presented on yesterday?
I would say within the border.
It's more dangerous. And the crossing of the border is a moment of,
for the one that I presented on yesterday, I would say the crossing of the border is possible. There's a hope there. There's hopefulness there, right? There's hope there. But within that space, within the actual border,
right,
the hope is lost.
Yeah, I think this is why it's an important question, because this is also a side of theory and basic assumptions about what opens possibilities, what kind of subjects can, what produces new subjects, new subjectivities, the crossing of borders, and there's this kind of basic sense that territory without borders is a positive. You can tell from my talk that I don't always think that. I think there's lots of places where there's limits that if we don't observe the limits, there's violence is committed. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you very much, Krista. As usual, I learn an awful lot when I listen to you, and I struggle sometimes to understand. I wonder if you, I mean, are you willing to sort of summarize or speculate at least a little further about where you're at in thinking through this complicated notion of feminist states? I mean, where are you going with this? I mean, can you say any more, or?
Well, I mean, that's the part I'm trying to figure out. And I actually gave you a fairly clear version of this today, you know, in the many versions that have existed. I'm trying ultimately to put together some of the stuff I'm learning from surfers and where they do different activist projects with what I'm doing in literature. So where am I with this right now? I don't know that I can give you more than I just gave you, Alan. Can you ask me a question of where you're confused?
Can I ask? Can I
Yeah,
answer?
sure.
Because I was kind of pondering the same thing, and I think what struck me is the use of the plural seemed to me quite significant, that it was because to me there's this weird thing, isn't there? We use the word state, which has all these kind of political ramifications and associations, and then you use the word feminist states, which to me seemed significant in the way you were thinking through those ideas. And I don't know whether that's something which might help with that as well.
Thank you. I mean, I don't conceive the border state that I was talking about with Cisneros and Anzaldúa and Maria Amparo Escandon. That's not the same state as the state that's at the border of Erdrich's text, which isn't necessarily the same state as the one that's at the border of the Osage Nation. I could imagine the Osage Nation and the Erdrich texts being linked regionally as trans-regional feminist states. But I think that's a different feminist state than the state that's on the border. I hope that's helpful. So, I mean, I think that it's I think that most people are unpersuaded that nationalism should continue as a viable sense of belonging. So I envision this as a different politicized sense of belonging that's very place-based. So there's lots of different kinds of feminist states, but yeah. I mean, there's a lot more to say about this, obviously, like the conceptual center of the book.
Do we have any more comments or questions, or we still have about a minute?
This is why it's like usually more fun to work on surfing.
Okay, well, I think that gives us just enough time to stretch our legs before the next session, but can I thank Krista for a really wonderful presentation, very stimulating. Thank you.